I'm ever feeling in a rut, I will go out and shoot with them.
Vintage lenses have their own quirks and characteristics that make them extremely special.
It's fun, and it's as simple as that.
I'm not out here to capture the cleanest, most neutral, sterile, or I'm gonna say lifeless images.
I can find high-quality vintage lenses for a fraction of the cost of modern ones.
I think human beings emotionally resonate more with imperfect instruments.
Really magical, surreal, and sort of swirly, beautiful.
Vintage lenses are a little tricky. Some people hate them, some people love them, are obsessed with them. They only shoot on vintage lenses. But honestly, most people have no clue about vintage lenses whatsoever. So I decided to make this video just to give a little bit more insight as to why certain people choose to shoot on vintage lenses. I knew I could not be the only person that gave input when it came to the video I wanted to make. So I asked a couple YouTube creators that I look up to if they were willing to share their thoughts, and they were. Here's some thoughts from my friends around the world that know way more than me, and I'll see you at the end just to wrap it up and share my own thoughts.
Hey, Anthony. Thank you for letting me join the conversation today. My name's Mairs. I'm a filmmaker in Chicago, and I'm also a creator here on YouTube. Now, the question of the day is, why vintage glass? Why in 2023 are so many of us looking to use lenses manufactured back in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, or whatever your flavor is, right? It's a great question. In order to understand my answer, I think you need to know where I'm coming from. And there are two things that are really going to influence or bias my decision, my answer, if you will. Now, the first bias is going to be a real core value of mine to capture as much as I possibly can in camera. All right, and that second bias is going to be my artistic style, my creative preferences, if you will. I'm not out here to capture the cleanest, most neutral, sterile, or I'm gonna say lifeless images. I really lean into images that have character. And by character, I often mean imperfections in the lens. And that could look like lens flares. It could be bloomed highlights. It could be color shifts. It could be dust or scratches on the lenses, right? All of those things are very unique. They're imperfect, they're authentic, they're human. None of us are perfect, so to capture a perfect image would no longer be human. So if you take those two biases and you put them in an equation, the answer is vintage lenses. You can capture an image that has a lot of character, and you can do it in camera. So the math adds up for me. Hopefully that helps somebody out there. Anthony, thank you for having me on your channel. To everybody else watching, make sure you drop down below, hit subscribe, like this video, because it takes a lot of work to orchestrate something like this on Anthony's end. So show him some love there. He's got some great stuff on his channel as well. My name's Mairs. Happy shooting.
Man, Troy, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on the channel. I recently met Troy via Instagram not too long ago, and he's a super solid dude. I could just tell when he's talking about things on his YouTube channel that he's just genuine. He means what he says, and he actually believes what he says, so go check him out. But the next person you're going to be hearing from, his name is Mathieu Stern. He's in France, I believe. He does videos on the weirdest, most interesting vintage lenses out there. Super knowledgeable on the topic, so I'm glad he was able to share and enjoy his thoughts.
Hi, I'm Mathieu Stern. I'm a French photographer and YouTuber. I review weird lenses, vintage lenses, and unique cameras. So why do I prefer vintage lenses over modern ones? I love using vintage lenses for a few reasons. First, these lenses have unique characteristics, such as soft, dreamy bokeh or even swirly bokeh that can add a lot of character to your images. They are often more affordable than modern lenses. I can find high-quality vintage lenses for a fraction of the cost of modern ones. When I started collecting vintage lenses, I could find a 1.4 vintage lens for 20 euros. This allows me to experiment with different focal lengths and styles without breaking the bank. Vintage lenses were made with high-quality materials and craftsmanship, which means they can be in excellent shape even after 50 years. I also love to experiment with weird vintage lenses that were not used to take photos, like projector lenses that have some incredible swirly bokeh. I hope you can find some weird and vintage lenses to experiment with.
Thanks, Mathieu. Seriously, guys, go check him out. All of these channels are linked down in the description. He really does have some interesting videos on vintage lenses. But the next person that's going to be speaking, you guys might know him for his phantom LUTs that he's made for many different camera systems. But he's also an extremely talented cinematographer and DP, and he chooses to use vintage lenses for most of his projects. So he's going to be on. You've seen him on the channel once, but Joel, take it away.
Okay, so the reason that I personally love shooting with vintage lenses is, number one, the look. Imagine a meal that is great, but is a bit bland. What do people typically do? They reach for the salt and pepper, they reach for spices, maybe some chili, maybe some paprika, maybe some garlic, whatever. To me, I think we trust images and sounds that come through imperfect, perceptual instruments more than we trust perfectly recorded instruments, sound, measurements. And the other thing that's great about them in a really practical sense is they're cheap. You can get full frame, fast lenses with a lot of character for like under $1,000 on eBay. I've got some examples here. I've got a nice 50mm Canon FD f1.2, produces an incredible image, and 1.2, right? Incredibly fast and full frame. Here's a little Russian Jupiter 3 50mm f1.5, just creamy imagery. So yeah, to sum up, old lenses rock, give them a try. They work really nicely with modern digital sensors. They're a great counterbalance to the sharpness and the digital perfection of a lot of these new sensors. And you know, they're cheap, so they're a great way to experiment with new looks and give your footage a bit more flavor, a bit more of an edge, a bit more of that, again, that chemical, imperfect flavor that I think human beings actually feel very comfortable with.
Man, that was awesome. The next person you're going to be hearing from is actually somebody that I use as a resource a lot when I first got into vintage lenses. His name is Mark Holtze. So without further ado, take away, Mark, and explain why vintage.
Why do you choose to use vintage lenses? It's fun, and it's as simple as that. All right, I wouldn't have started down this rabbit hole if I didn't enjoy the overall experience of using vintage lenses. It definitely takes a bit more of a commitment. They're harder to find, especially ones that aren't filled with fungus. They have to be adapted or modified depending on how you use them. They're manual focus, and they're not what you would call by modern standards optically perfect. So yeah, you might be wondering why fun is the first thing that comes to mind. For me, it's these elements combined that really contribute to the overall experience. When using vintage lenses, I do find myself a bit more inspired to experiment based on their unique optical characteristics. And it was through that process of experimentation that I really started to see the true value of using these lenses with modern cameras. And what started out as a hobby quickly evolved into a professional tool set that could lend itself to the work I do in the film and television industry. I'm not shooting any big budget feature films, but even Academy Award winner DP Greg Fraser saw the value of using a rehoused Helios 44-2 in The Batman. The community is also a big part of what elevates the experience. Being able to share what I love with others, but also learn from them is invaluable. There's always someone out there who knows a little bit more and can help shift your perspective a bit, which is always a valuable asset when working in a creative space. So yeah, the fun part really is the sum of all parts. The hunt, the effort, the challenge, the character and texture, the community, and of course the results. Some of these old lenses even have some really interesting stories behind them as well. How deep you want to go really is up to you. Keep it simple or jump in hardcore with both feet. Now, this is why I choose to use vintage lenses. I enjoy it. Anthony, thank you so much for having me on and letting me gush about this stuff. It's an honor for me to be here amongst these wonderful creators, and thank you so much for having me on your channel. This was fun. Have I said fun enough for you yet?
I think you could have said fun a couple more times. So the next person you're going to be hearing from is actually somebody I found out about recently. His name is Ed. Super talented DP, saw his work, loved it, knew he shot on vintage lenses, so I asked him to share his thoughts on the channel, and enjoy.
Hi, I'm Ed. I'm a director and DOP based in London. Okay, so why do I love vintage lenses? Well, I guess when I first got into filmmaking, those were the only types of lenses that I could afford. 10 years ago or so, you could pick up, amazing old vintage lenses for around 30-40 pounds on eBay. It's like $50-60. As I did that, I began to discover that just because these lenses were old and cheap didn't mean that they were defective or irrelevant, and they kind of introduced me to the sort of new way of image making by leaning into the sort of quirks that these lenses had. You know, a lot of people might call them flaws. I'd call them the characteristics and personality of these lenses. Whereas when I was shooting with like modern glass, it all sort of looked the same. It was all sort of pushing towards getting this very clean, sharp look. By using these vintage lenses, that sort of really began to influence my style of image making, because nowadays I do tend to lean into a grungier and grittier look in the stuff that I make. I don't tend to sort of push a very sort of clean or pristine, faithful commercial image in my work. For a long time, sharpness was this thing that all sort of camera manufacturers and lens makers were pushing for, in terms of, you know, what made a camera or lens perfect. But I sort of, because I was using these vintage lenses, I sort of began to learn that, you know, perfection isn't necessarily the pinnacle of all we should achieve or want to achieve or aspire to achieve. So using vintage lenses can really add nice, distinctive, creative flourishes to the images you're capturing, and it can help sort of distinguish your images from other people, because everyone's using modern lenses. You know, everyone buys a camera that comes with a kit lens, which is a modern lens. I guess over the years, using these vintage lenses, it's just sort of gone hand in hand with what I do. I just think they can help you produce these really magical, surreal, and sort of swirly, beautiful images in a way that you just can't do with modern lenses. So yeah, that's why I love vintage lenses, because they're unpredictable, they're weird, they're strange, they're a little bit fuzzy around the edges, and I guess that's kind of everything that I am too. So yeah, see you later.
Yeah, I definitely relate to that last point. For the last person, his name is Edmund Hansen. He uses vintage lenses, I think almost strictly. He has maybe like 1 or 2 modern lenses. So he has a ton of experience with the glass. So enjoy his experience and reasons why he chose to shoot on vintage lenses.
Why do I use vintage lenses? Well, let's go back in time to the beginning of my career. I was a stop motion animator. From there, I got a mini DV camcorder and I practiced my cinematography. And once I got to a level where I was actually making money, I graduated to the coveted 5D Mark II. You see, I started this way before there was reliable autofocus for video. And if you know anything about stop motion animation or cell animation or even using a 5D Mark II, you know that you have to use your hands. I grew up in a family of carpenters and mechanics. I learned how to use my hands to create things when I was just a little kid. And because vintage lenses require fully manually focusing, that is something that just appealed to me. And yes, you may be saying, well, you can use modern lenses and still use your hands, but there's a big difference. Their focusing mechanisms are entirely different, or they don't even have iris rings. Although vintage lenses have their own quirks and characteristics that make them extremely special, the main reason why I choose to use them over modern glass is because they require more focus and more of myself in order to get the image that I'm looking for.
So honestly, after listening to all the videos that they sent in, I really don't have that much more that I can add, but this is just my personal experience with vintage lenses and why I chose them. Another thing I will mention is I'm shooting on the 25mm contact Zeiss lens, and I'm actually shooting my second angle with a Sigma 24-70, which is a modern lens. I wanted to use vintage and modern glass just so you can see the differences when I cut them together. It's more so like a comparison, but it's kind of a lazy man's comparison because I really just didn't want to do a bunch of tests. I didn't have the time for it. You might not notice on YouTube, but I can tell right away when I was editing the footage from those two different lenses, so I hope it helps. Something that I could never put my finger on, but a couple people when they sent in videos mentioned the same exact thing, is they do give you a feeling of being more human. I don't know how to explain it. A lot of people chalk it up to character. And while I do think that that's a good way to explain it, the fact that the images look more imperfect, therefore look more human, actually makes a lot of sense to me. Not everybody has 20/20 vision, and even if they do, you get stuff in your glasses, you get stuff in your eyes, sometimes your eyes get a little blurry. Things don't even necessarily look crystal clear. I know the feeling I get when I'm watching a film or video that has a super sharp digital look, and that's personally not the same feeling that I want my viewers to have when they're watching my work of any kind, if it's client work, YouTube, anything like that. So that's one reason why I choose to shoot on vintage lenses. I'm not saying vintage lenses is the only way to achieve this look. You could soften your image, you can grade it in a certain way, but vintage lenses were the medium that got me started into chasing this homey, cinematic feel. I know those are really airy words and it doesn't really help in explaining the look behind vintage lenses, but like Joel said, it takes a sharp, modern digital sensor and adds lively character to it. One thing I'll touch on briefly, because I'm not going in depth, this isn't a whole masterclass on vintage lenses, but there are several different types, manufacturers, models of vintage lenses that look really different, just like there are different lenses today. I personally chose the contact Zeiss lenses because they are sharp. They're really sharp actually, but they still have that vintage feel to them. I originally purchased the Canon FDs, and those for me looked the best, but they were so vintage in my opinion that I couldn't use them on client shoots unless it was a specific client shoot. They weren't like crazy soft either. They were really sharp too, but they definitely had too much of a look for client shoots. If it was just for personal usage, I would use them all the time, but I chose the contact Zeiss for that specific reason because it was like a happy medium for me. My second reason why I bought my first set of vintage lenses, as well as still use them, is actually not a reason, it's more of a consequence, a good one. It put me in a position to where I had to shoot with manual lenses. When I first started shooting, I completely relied on autofocus. I didn't really care about manual focusing. I just wanted to capture what was in front of me and maybe tell a story. Maybe I was just a bad filmmaker because I didn't use manual focus, but I was a pretty bad filmmaker. But vintage lenses really taught me how to use manual focus. So I guess cost was a factor on why I ended up buying vintage lenses. It was such a low barrier of entry that I was like, well, if I don't want them, I could just sell them and it won't really hurt me. But I ended up loving them, and now I'm here spending all this time making a whole video on why vintage lenses are so useful for you guys. And honestly, there's not much else I can say. This isn't a how to buy, how to use, what to buy kind of video. It's just an argument for vintage lenses in general. But if you've never tried vintage lenses before, I highly recommend just buying one. They're super cheap. This is a Helios 44-2. I think I spent $50 on this one. That one's actually one of my favorites. It has this like swirly, crazy look to it. I know a lot of people say gear doesn't matter, and while I agree to a certain extent, for me, it matters a lot. And that's not necessarily because of codecs or frame rates or whatever. There's just certain gear that inspires me to shoot more. And this isn't just a business for me. I genuinely love filmmaking. I love telling stories. I love capturing beautiful images. But if a piece of gear encourages me to shoot more, which means make more money, and at the same time love what I'm doing while I'm doing it, then it's worth it to me. And vintage lenses was that for me when I first got into them. So I don't use them on every client project, but when I do have a project that I'm able to use them, I do go for my contact Zeiss lenses because it does inspire me more than just using a photo zoom to capture an event or anything like that. Like I said, this isn't an entire masterclass for vintage lenses, so if you have any questions, whatever it is, ask them down below and I'll get to them. I'll even have some of the people that were in this video answering some of the questions if they can. A huge thanks to everyone that was able to collaborate. Links to their channels will be down below. Go check them out. They're incredible people. So for those that stuck around, here's a quick little life update. I'm actually having a baby. So my wife and I are going to Italy for a baby moon. I didn't even know those existed, but we're having one last hoorah before we have a child. But that means that for the next 2 weeks, I won't be making as much content, if any at all. But when I do get back, I'm actually making a video on the Ronin 4D because it's a camera I'm recently purchasing to replace my Komodo. There are tons of reasons why. I actually bought it, sold it to buy the Komodo, and then bought the 4D again, not just because I'm a YouTuber or I can't make up my mind. There are specific calculated reasons why, and I can't wait to share. If this video was helpful for you, hit that like button below. It really helps the algorithm. Consider subscribing if you want to be updated for the Ronin 4D video or other videos coming in the future, and I'll see you in the next one.